In 1851, a controversial and revolutionary piece of clothing suddenly came into fashion, namely the clothing of bloomers. Bloomers were lower-body women's garments that were similar to men's trousers. They were worn under a knee-length dress and allowed women much more freedom to move around in than a traditional floor-length petticoat and restrictive corset outfit. Bloomers were inspired by Turkish dress and were favored by Turkish women for convenience and fashion. In 1851, Amelia Bloomer first wore the bloomer's outfit and began the so-called bloomer craze of 1851.
Up until mid-19th century, the clothes that women wore were entirely based upon what was fashionable at that time, no matter how uncomfortable or potentially dangerous the clothes could be. In the early 1800s, the ideal silhouette for women was an extremely thin hourglass shape, a shape that would have been impossible to achieve naturally. In order to obtain this desired shape, women would wear a very stiff piece of clothing called a corset, which essentially forcibly molded her body and made her waist extremely small. So small, in fact, that continued use of the corset could actually shift the position of her organs and give her respiratory problems due to the continued pressure on her lungs. When a woman finally finished dressing in her layers upon layers of clothing, she could end up putting on an entire extra 25 pounds. With the new fashion trend of bloomers, women were finally being given the opportunity to dress in a way that would not restrict her day-to-day life.
The rise of the fashion trend of the bloomers was so revolutionary because it allowed women to step outside of preconceived norms of what women should wear and challenge female gender roles as being solely domestic ones. With the newly accessible movement and freedom the bloomers granted, women now had a greater opportunity to work and travel outside. Because of their newfound freedom, some men found the new bloomers dress extremely threatening to a possible upheaval of the status quo of male dominance and female servility. As a result, when women began to wear them in public, several newspapers and magazines verbally attacked bloomers and the women who wore them, denouncing them as immoral. Shortly after the rise of the fashion trend of bloomers, the numerous critics mocking the bloomer style of dress forced the women to stop wearing them and revert to the traditional, restrictive style of women's dress. Some of the women stopped for reasons such as avoiding public humiliation. Others, like the suffragists, stopped because the extreme reactions the bloomers brought were hindering progress on other goals concerning women's rights.
This kind of critical reaction to the bloomers movement was surprisingly similar to the situation of the women's rights advocates. Many of the female reformers were similarly belittled and mocked in their public attempts for social change. Both the bloomers and the women's rights advocates were denounced by the public because of a fear of social upheaval of traditional gender roles. However, even though bloomers were not in fashion for a long period of time, the advent of a change in traditional women's clothing helped to exacerbate the goals of the women's rights movement. A huge shift in perspective was happening both physically with the bloomers and mentally with the new ideas suffrage brought. The Seneca Falls Convention rallied supporters for the cause, as well as inspired the Rochester Convention 2 weeks later. It was there that Abigail Bush became the first female chairman presiding over a mixed audience. Her presence marked a huge step in the progress of women's rights.
The bloomers were so significant in aiding the women's rights movement because while the female reformers provided political success, in order to fully transform women's lives, a change needed to occur within the social world of non-reformer women. Bloomers allowed normal women to support the women's rights movement without fully investing themselves in politics. Therefore, bloomers, in conjunction with the women's rights conventions, gave normal women more power and the ability to live outside of the realm of the cult of domesticity.